Hello all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are in. My name is Shai, but I'm not really shy. I consider myself to be very fortunate to be the global leader of the executive compensation and board advisory business at WTW, formerly known as Willis Towers Watson. WTW is one of the world's oldest and largest executive compensation consulting practices, and we have about 500 dedicated consultants in 50 countries who serve as trusted advisors to the remuneration committees, nominations and governance committees, and increasingly sustainability committees. I'm also very fortunate to be a member of the Climate Governance Initiative, CGI's Global Governing Board. And on behalf of CGI, thank you for joining us for this very important conversation titled Incentivizing for Success, the Role of Remuneration in Climate Transition Plans. We have an exceptional lineup of panelists who will share their insights and experience on this important topic, but please allow me to set the context a bit. As organizations acknowledge the need to transition to a net zero business model, investors and broader stakeholders expect board members not only to drive the adoption of a credible climate transition strategy, but also to provide clear evidence that its execution has been embedded effectively across all key management processes, including enterprise risk management, strategic planning, innovation, capital allocations, and human capital governance. One critical lever is for management to be held accountable for the delivery of the climate strategy and ensuring alignment of interest through incentives. This is also aligned with the World Economic Forum and Climate Governance Initiative's 8 principles of climate governance, and in particular, Principle 6, incentivization, talks about or says that the board should ensure that executive incentives are aligned to promote the long-term prosperity of the company. And in the interest of providing practical guidance to companies on this topic, WTW partnered with CGI, and in November 2021, we published the Executive Compensation Guidebook for Climate Transition. For those of you interested, the guidebook is available on the CGI and WTW websites. And I'm very pleased to announce that today we actually launched an addendum to this guidebook, which highlights the key regulatory trends, investors' expectations, and market practice developments over the past 18 months since the original guide was published. The CGI team shall send the links to both the guidebook and the addendum after the webinar, but please feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions. If you are watching a recorded version of this webinar later, please check the video descriptions for a link. And finally, this webinar was produced by Climate Governance Initiative, which is an initiative in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. It provides a platform for non-executive and independent directors to drive climate action from the boardroom, delivered through its network of chapters based around the world. If you're not already a member of your local chapter, please consider joining and availing of the tremendous resources that CGI offers. So please feel free to visit the CGI website for more information. Right, so now let's look at the agenda a bit. And what we want to cover today is we'll spend the first 20 minutes or so on a fireside chat with a very distinguished panelist and member, Angeles Garcia-Poveda, and I'll introduce her in a second. And after that, we'll do a panel discussion. And the panel discussion will hear from perspectives from panelists across the world. And very deliberately, we've selected panelists who represent different geographies and industries. So it is going to be fairly packed. It is going to be very interesting and informative. And without further ado, let's get started. So the first session being a fireside chat with Angeles Garcia-Poveda. So please allow me to share a little bit about her, and I'm sure I'm not going to do justice. But Angeles has been the chairperson of the board of Legrand since July 2020. She joined the board as an independent director in 2012 and chaired the Nominations and Governance Committee and the Remuneration Committee, and has also sat on the Strategy and CSR committees and has served as a lead independent director or lead director since 2013. Angeles is also senior advisor at Spencer Stuart within their governance practice. She joined the firm in 2008 and prior to that worked with the Boston Consulting Group. She sits on the board of directors of Edenred and on the board of directors of Bridgepoint. She's a member of the executive council of MEDEF. She also sits on the board of directors of IFA and Neoma. But close to our hearts, Angeles also serves on the advisory board of the Climate Governance Initiative. Welcome, Angeles. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Shai. Very happy to be with all of you today, wherever you are.
Fantastic. So perhaps we could get started, Angeles. Could you please share your experience on integrating sustainability strategy with business strategy? And how have your various boards approached this topic of climate governance?
Sure. I think it's a key question, and one that might differ a little bit depending on which sector you're operating in. In the case of Legrand, we are very lucky because, as you know, Legrand is a global specialist in digital and electrical infrastructures for buildings. Mm-hmm. So our mission and our purpose is to electrify the economy and therefore decarbonize. And in a way, it is already, you use the word embedding in your initial comments. It's already embedded in what we do, right? Our job is basically to help others save carbon tons in a way, if you look at it from a very high level perspective. Now, it is a different thing to actually bring it to life in everything we do. And this is something that we have been working on, not yesterday, not the day before yesterday. It actually started after 15 years ago. We are this year in the first year of the 5th roadmap.
Oh, wow.
And all of them are multi-year, as you can imagine. So it's been a journey and something that has been built over time. First, to create the tools and the measures that allowed us to know what the starting point was and where the pain points were, and how we could identify priorities and objectives, short-term, medium-term, and long-term, and then getting the organization in motion, which means a variety of things, from rethinking operations to doing a lot of training and communication, to embarking our countries in that journey, and of course, including ESG objectives and climate objectives in remunerations was one of the levers, and a very important one. And I'm sure we can elaborate on that further on.
Brilliant, thank you. Very interesting way to set the context, and I was really pleased to hear about the 5th roadmap. So this is clearly something that doesn't happen overnight. It requires a lot of thought and attention, and it's great to see that commitment on that multi-year roadmap. Perhaps a follow-on to that, there are so many, I wouldn't say skeptics, but there are people who would ask the question, what is more important, purpose or profits? Or what is more important, sustainability or financial performance? Personally, I have a view that that's perhaps not the right question to be asking, but I would love to hear your perspective on that.
I don't know that I even want to answer that question. I don't believe we are in that state anymore. I have to be honest. I don't believe that we are anymore. And this is good news at a moment where we have to make the case for any of this. We don't need to choose, and we cannot choose. We don't need to choose because we deeply believe at Legrand that we can provide, and this is what we have been doing for years now, sustainable, profitable growth. And that's the way we do business, and it's actually the right to do business, is now to be also very conscious about the impact we have in our environment, in society, in all our stakeholders, and that's the kind of company we want to be, right? So for us, there's no choice anymore. Now, I don't want to be or to sound naive either. It is true that we have a responsibility towards our investors and our shareholders. And many times in conversations with them, well, we have felt clearly a very, very strong growing interest in these matters, which is good news, to the extent that we actually conduct ESG focused roadshows. We have, once a year, at least one very specific session where we sit with all our investors and agencies and deeply analyze what we are doing and where we want to go. But we also have different sensitivities. And in some contexts, we find ourselves in front of investors who say, we love what you do, but please tell us that you're not going to give away the very profitable model that you got us used to. And and some of them asking the opposite question, like we had very recently. One of them asked, given this very important energy crisis that we are going through, does this change your focus and does this change your commitment? And we said, no, it's quite the opposite, because actually, see what happened is because the energy prices went up so much, actually some of our investment projects that could or might have been less interesting in terms of opportunity cost in other contexts became very, very interesting and relevant. So you know what we did? We accelerated. Not only did we not slow down, we accelerated. So thinking about all these moving pieces,
fantastic.
And then being able to show that when we look at industrial operations, when we look at rethinking at suppliers, when we look at rethinking at how we design products, we are not only treating one problem at a time. We are rethinking products to use less materials and less raw materials, because it's very, very high in our carbon footprint agenda. But also guess what? If we use less raw materials, we buy less raw materials, right? So, and we transport them less. So it's also beneficial for our P&L. And I think this is not about fixing a problem. This is an industrial revolution.
I love that.
And if we think about it as an opportunity to actually reinvent our businesses, I think then we can really create something that's sustainable. And we can really create something that will find enough funding. We can really create something that is interesting also for those who are skeptics.
Fantastic.
Oh,
sorry, please, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was going to say, I really like that. An industrial revolution, because it is a different way of thinking about businesses. It's not solving a problem or ticking a box. It's how we do business to begin with, or it should become how we do business to begin with. That is brilliant insight. Thank you. Maybe just moving to specifics around remuneration. So what has your experience been as a board chair and remuneration committee chair in engaging with management and with investors on incorporating climate measures specifically in executive pay?
So, well, needless to say, these objectives are embedded in the CEO's compensation, both short-term and long-term. And I'll come back to that, because I think we're speaking about topics that are on the long-term journey, right? So you're playing with those two horizons is really important, because otherwise you can't really, put the lever at the right place. And they have been for a while. I think where we have progressed as a board, as a committee, and in our conversations with management, is in getting better at making those objectives relevant. Cascading them in the organization. And now they actually go till the country manager level. I mean, all the top management in the organization is incentivized. So it's a really important point. So it's present in people's minds, making them relevant enough in terms of proportion. but also with time, learning how to quantify more and more. And I think one of the latest things that we did last year was actually to increase the part of quantitative criteria versus qualitative criteria. And because I'm a deep believer on what gets measured gets done, I just think that that journey is healthy. There's still challenges when it comes to measurement and action on scope 3, and I think many people will share that same perspective. It's obviously more difficult to act there and to make sure that we have the right balance between ambition and realism. That's the challenge that I think we have in front of us. But it's a move that is it's already in motion, really. And what we try to do is make sure that at committee level, at board level, there is enough understanding of the criteria themselves to be able to apprehend the performance and to have the right conversations. I think remuneration is important, but it's only a good reason to have conversations, if that makes sense. It's the conversation that transforms things. It's not remuneration by itself.
I love that. It's the conversation and the intent behind the conversation, not the remuneration itself. And particularly, I enjoyed the concept about cascading, because that's a way of ensuring alignment, not just with one or two levels in the organization, but the entire organization working towards a goal. Thank you. So you spoke about quantitative KPIs. I'm a very big believer in that myself. And actually, we analyzed 1,000+ companies globally. And the biggest change in the last 12 months is the increase in use of quantitative KPIs and disuse of qualitative KPIs, which I thought was positive. But perhaps on that, what challenges have you experienced around target setting, and have you overcome those? And more building on that, how important is it to have performance targets that can be externally validated?
Yes. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think the challenge is to, like with any target, is to make sure that you find that fine balance between ambition and realism. Because if you set it too high, that is unattainable, then people will stop trying and fighting. And if you set them too low and they become too easy, then it doesn't really, you don't make the progress you're going to make. So nothing new under the sun. I would say for us, we did have to do a little bit of a leap of faith at the beginning, saying, okay, let's start. I mean, of course, let's start with neutrality, and then let's work backwards, right? And where, when, and how do we think it is realistic to make a commitment of progress? And we did set, I would say, 3 different horizons. One is full neutrality at 2050, then a mid step at 2030, and then working backwards from there, our roadmaps, which give a 3-annual objective, but also an annual objective, right? And if we are in advance, we don't really stop trying to get more advanced for the next roadmap. That's another important piece, is that we should not, constrain ourselves, because we are in a highly fast-moving environment. What I see is that sometimes actually companies progress faster than what they thought. And we need to make sure that the remuneration schemes allow for that also.
Excellent.
And allow for actually kickers that reward faster progress than expected, because that's where we want to go, right? And oftentimes you find schemes that are designed to cope more with the underperformance than with the overperformance. So that's, I think, something we should always have in mind. The other thing is external validations are useful, because this is new. because we all need some kind of, homogeneous, normalized way of looking at the world. It's also easier, obviously, for external third parties, whether those are investors or, agencies or proxies, to sort of understand what we are doing and what we're talking about, and to compare apples to apples. So yes, we do. And obviously all our targets and scenarios are SBTi validated. That level helps bringing clarity and trust. So I do think it's useful, but it's also not an easy task. And today, the amount of administrative burden that comes into all this, labels and indexes and so on and so forth, is sometimes, I just sometimes feel we could spend part of that time actually doing things rather than counting them.
Fair.
But it is a necessary step, and it will come a time, as you know, we are waiting right now in Europe for the whole new scheme around how we account, how we measure, how we disclose and communicate on climate matters. And we, once that is settled and landed, I think it will be part of, the day-to-day job. But until we get there, it is this extra work. It's extra work for the teams. It's extra work for the people who study. So I think we just need to allow for a little adjustment time, if that makes sense, until everybody gets on the same level of maturity. But, we cannot function if we don't have a common language.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm reminded of that very famous line by the great Mr. Presley: time for little less conversation, little more action, which is a very recurring theme as we talk about these topics. But thank you. I'm conscious of time, Angeles. So maybe one question, and then we'll move to the panel. So across your various boards, different industries, different geographies, are you seeing any differences in how different constituents are looking at this? Are you seeing any innovative trends? You spoke about that time element as an accelerator, which I thought is really clever, but anything else?
Well, the obvious answer is yes, but I think I should ask you the question, Shai, because you're the remuneration specialist who sees everything that happens from WW. I think the levels of maturity and of willingness to sort of be more prescriptive in this do vary by geography. In France, the last version of the soft law code, the code AFEP-MEDEF, which is the one that every listed company uses for governance, already included a strong recommendation to include in CEO criteria at least one criteria linked to climate. And that was a very strong statement that I think has helped a lot progress things. It's not hard law, and I don't think we need hard law. I think well-applied soft law seems to be a very good way to do things. In other places, we are far from there. But there are innovative things. I think you and I, in some of our prep work, we're discussing this trade-off between agreeing on the target and letting the time piece a little more free, or agreeing on the time and, or the balance between the two at least. And then I would say the other, I think, key question, which is still an open question to me, is how do we go about intensity? And I'll come back to that. Right now, we have been working with a hypothesis, which is, let's take a baseline and let's talk about absolute decrease, right? Yeah. That's what we know. We know we can only work on like for like.
Yeah.
Actually, is a slightly unrealistic way looking at the economy, because our job is to make these companies
grow. Yeah.
Because we also need to produce the profits that, amongst other things, will finance the transition, right? So we need to grow. And therefore, the most important thing is not the absolute decrease, in my mind, is the relative decrease. And how do you make sure that every additional ton or every additional billion of revenues that you add is greener and greener and greener over time, right? And that we're not creating ourselves another program for the future. So that piece I start hearing about. I think it's a very, very important one, and one that is even less decoded and regulated than the rest. So probably the next frontier.
Fantastic. Thank you, Angeles. That's excellent. Like I said, we could continue this conversation for hours,
Yeah.
but really appreciate you setting the scene, and it's a very strong platform into the panel. So thank you. But perhaps we'll move interest of time to the next section, which is getting into the conversation with our panelists. And I'm very thrilled that we have some very distinguished panelists, very seasoned board members who very deliberately come from different parts of the world. So please allow me to introduce our panelists. We have Nicholas Allen, who's the independent non-executive chairman of Link Asset Management Limited and independent non-executive director of CLP Holdings Limited, Hong Kong Exchange and Clearing House Limited, and the London Metal Exchange based in Hong Kong. Nick is based in Hong Kong. We also have Natasha Landell-Mills, who's the head of stewardship and partner at Sarasin and Partners. She's a non-executive director at Carbon Tracker, and she's based in London. And then we have Eliane Rouillet-Chevalier, non-executive board member at Ipsos and Legrand, head of governance and climate executive education program at Université Paris Dauphine, and member of the steering committee of Chapter Zero France. She's based in Paris. Welcome all. Thank you for making the time. So perhaps let's get started. Eliane, if I may come to you first. How important do you think is it to align climate goals with executive incentive plans? And how prominent should this be on the agenda of the whole board?
Thank you. Thank you, Shai, for the introduction. I'll start with the second part of the question, if I may,
Please.
At least for three reasons. The first one being that, as it was mentioned already by Angeles, climate issue is first and before very strategic, and it's a business issue. We know all how overwhelming this issue is for any company, whatever the sector, whatever the size of the geography. No one can ignore the direct or indirect consequences of the global warming in terms of supply chain, production processes, transportation, energetic or food independence, but also public health or possible social unrest or political instability. And as a major business issue with potential impact upon the strategy trajectory, decarbonization steering, massive investments, management of stranded assets, or choice of new technology, it has to be put on board agenda. That is the first reason. The second is that corporates are called for responsibility and action, as well as government or public institutions. Every organization, private or public, individuals have to take their own share in terms of responsibility, and both have to put on their agenda what is at stake with climate issues. Once understanding and then integrating these climate challenges, how the company reviews the strategy and assesses the strategic moves, how the company paves the way for adaptation first and mitigation then. And third, the stakeholders' pressure as a result of international regulation, particularly in Europe with the green taxonomy and the coming soon CSRD. Legal pressure, we see more and more trial against states, against corporates, board members. Say on climate resolutions in AGM, I'm sure we will talk to that again. And as a whole, civil society pressure and reputational issues. So of course, I come to the first part of the question. You understand how, given the importance of this strategic concern, it has to be, we have to be sure on the alignment between the executives and the board members. And compensation schemes are, of course, a lever to achieve and to put the link between the decarbonization objectives and realizations in a very visible, comprehensive manner. Yeah, and that's my conclusion. It's clear that it's a signal sent to stakeholders, not only shareholders.
Yeah.
How important the climate issues is in terms of strategy, how serious it is considered, either from the management side or the board side.
Thank you, Eliane, and appreciate you sharing a lot of this, not just the remit of the remuneration committee, but should be the agenda for the whole board, because this is something that is, again, germane to how you ensure alignment and the signaling that goes behind that. Thank you, really appreciate that. Perhaps then, Natasha, if we could turn to you, and a question around how are investors' expectations around this topic evolving? How have your interactions been with investors or with remuneration committees about this notion of linking climate strategies with remuneration?
Thank you, and thank you very much for the introduction earlier and the previous comments. I mean, I think I'm going to start by just echoing the kind of core point, which is that it is really, really important, I think, from an investor perspective, that we get the alignment of incentives. And I think the angle that I would tend to emphasize is that what we need to ensure is that executives are not being rewarded for behavior which is contrary to achieving the goal, because otherwise what we're ending up doing is attempting to push water uphill. And I think there's pretty much alignment on that across the investor community. I think a good benchmark for seeing that alignment is a Climate Action 100+ framework, where within that you have really key and clear criteria around remuneration. They are linked to having a particular KPI that's climate related, as well as having a KPI that's tied into the strategy, to the climate targets specifically. But that's sort of as far as it goes. And in terms of how our conversations with remuneration committees have gone, I would say that I think that we're going to come up against problems with focusing in on one or two KPIs here or there. Mm-hmm. And that's where we have come to the view, and I think that this is gaining some traction, that we need a much more holistic approach. Mm. I think Angeles also referred to this, the kind of materiality point earlier. You know, we're referring to it as a kind of underpin approach, or what I would describe as a climate safeguard. In other words, what you need to have before any performance-related pay is distributed is a meeting of a minimum expectation that the net zero targets, the net zero strategy is on track. So in other words, you meet that, and then at that point, the other performance metrics can come in. So if that approach is adopted, of course, what that means is that you will never get bonuses paid out for climate harm. If you relegate it to 5% or 10% of the LTIP, and 90 to 95% of the LTIP is still being paid out for performance that is associated with climate harm, you have a problem. And I think you're going to get quite a lot of cynicism. So this underpin, or what I would call a climate safeguard approach, is not a new concept. Those who are in the banking sector, insurance sector will be familiar with it. You have capital adequacy underpins, which have to be met prior to performance-related pay. I would say we need a net zero underpin that needs to be there to ensure that is met before any performance-related pay. And as well as it not being just a new concept, I would say that I would point to legal in general, where, and there may be others, but this is where I've actually seen it applied on the sustainability side. They have actually an ESG sustainability underpin. I would say that it's a little bit vague right now. So we're asking them to make that much clearer, make it a net zero underpin, but they have it there already. So it's worth having a look at that.
Fantastic. I like the notion of underpins almost being table stakes. I mean, that before that, you don't pass that gate, you don't collect bonuses. There could be some companies who think that that's punitive, but that's what we want. We want to drive climate action and, like you say, discourage behaviors about doing harm. So thank you for that, Natasha. I suspect we'll come back to that. But interest of time, Nick, if I could turn to you, please. Question: what do you think is the role of private sector ahead of government and other institutions in driving this conversation and again, ensuring this alignment?
Shai, thanks for the question. I'm very much in the camp that says that this is a circle, hopefully virtuous, in which both government, private enterprise and consumers, individuals operate. And if they don't all operate together, then picking one particular aspect out makes it quite hard for it to work. So you do need government setting policy, you do need private enterprise that is reacting to stakeholders, and you do need the pressure that comes from consumers and customers, and kind of the NGO community, I feel, is the oil in that circle that kind of makes it all work. And looking at it today, I think that it varies very much, as Angeles said, industry by industry. So some industries have this process working quite well, and there is government involved, there are consumers involved, there are businesses involved, and as a consequence of that, you will get some fairly detailed net zero plans. And then at another end of the spectrum, you're going to have companies that don't feel government pressure, might not feel individual pressure, and almost volunteers in this process. And I think that in the average and in the round, those enterprises tend to have less rigor in their plans. And if you don't have rigor in the plans, as people have said, and you can't measure, then you can't take action and apply incentives to properly reward people for behavior.
Thank you. Very clear. And the virtuous cycle hopefully is something that it encourages the right behaviors and spurs more action. So thank you, Nicholas. Sorry, I should have mentioned you being based in Hong Kong. One difference that this part of the world has is we have a larger proportion of companies that have controlling shareholders. And so the shareholding structures being different, either it be families or it be sovereign wealth funds or government-linked companies, even listed companies, that does provide us, again, slightly different models of compensation governance. I actually have found that actually helps creativity because you don't have to fit everything in sort of proxy advisors checklists. But if you have any experience around this part of the world, but would love to hear a little bit more.
I agree with you. I think that you're right that you have a preponderance of companies that still have generational family ownership, but that for me brings a long-term view of strategy, and then, as you say, it's probably more conducive to having a strategy that is looking very positively at climate. So I don't see it as a negative. I think it's very important that you have multi-year views around what you're trying to achieve, and that sometimes you can get more quarter to quarter, half year to half year, year to year approaches when you don't have that shareholder background. The company boards that I sit on, 2 of them have no sponsoring shareholders and 1 does have a sponsoring shareholder. So I kind of see both sides of that story. Indeed.
The company board I sit on has very similar, 1 without and 1 with. But that in a sense is the nub of, or rather the spirit behind stewardship, where you start thinking about this as longer term assets and investments. Thank you, Nick. We may come back to that. But just moving, Eliane, what role do you see institutional investors playing in driving change, given their influence on voting outcomes in many major markets?
In Europe, if we come back to Europe as part of the Green Deal, which was set up by the EU, which says that the objective is to reduce by 55% the green emissions by 2030 and achieving the net zero by 2050. Of course, the world of finance is absolutely critical to achieve this ambitious goal. And institutional investors have regulatory compliance under the SFDR, which is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, where they have to justify their investment relying on ESG criteria. And of course, climate is one of the most important criteria with potential adverse impact of their decision. we see more and more activists, coalition arising to put pressure on management and boards, resolution in AGM under the Say on Climate may be requested, and conversations with shareholder engagement and boards are more and more present with a longer view on the strategy. And we've seen from proxies that in the absence of, I quote, obvious climate strategy, particularly regarding companies with high degree of carbon footprint, investors may vote either against the renewal of the board chairmanship or the chairperson of the ESG committee, or even the remuneration operate directly. So yes, of course, the role of institutional investors is absolutely critical.
And it is getting more complex, is it not? Recently, there was this group of Dutch investors who actually issued a statement saying that they would vote against any say on pay resolution, even if they feel they may be comfortable with the pay item, but they will vote against the say on pay if they feel the company is not doing enough on the climate side.
Absolutely.
So using any lever possible.
And if they judge as the ambition is not enough demanding, they will vote against. Yes,
very good.
Absolutely.
Very good. So we all have to pay more attention to this. So thank you. Natasha, maybe again on this theme of investors, to what extent is there consensus among different investors in their perspectives on how climate should be incorporated in executive pay? And how do you see this changing?
Thank you. I would say this is really a continuation of the point I was making earlier, in that I think there is consensus building. The Climate Action 100+ benchmark gives you an indication of that. And as we've heard, also some corporate governance codes are being updated on the centrality of having climate reflected in pay packages in some ways. And the way I see it evolving is this point around having a much more holistic approach to REM, not just having treating climate almost like it's a side issue, that you tick that box and then you go on and you do your performance over here, that you have much more kind of overarching approach, which is more of a climate safeguard or underpin approach. But what I would say, actually, just picking up on what Eliane was saying with regards to voting, and again, this is an evolving issue for investors that we have been hearing, is much more sophisticated voting strategies, which single in on particular asks that are contributing to delivering a net zero outcome. So as we've heard, holding the chair to account, for example, the overarching net zero strategy, holding in many cases, and increasingly, certainly in our case, the audit committee chair accountable for ensuring that climate is being properly reflected in the financial statements as well as the narrative reporting. And then, of course, holding the remuneration committee chair, as well as other members, to account for ensuring that the REM strategy is aligned with that overall commitment. And so I think you are seeing now that those expectations that have been a focus of engagement are being translated into voting strategy. Certainly, we have been voting against REMCOs for the past 3 years for that. Wow. Okay. And currently, for example, we will abstain if we don't see that overarching underpin present. Now, we realize that is a very ambitious ask right now. But I suppose our guiding light in this is the huge mammoth task we have in pivoting all of us, investors, businesses, civil society, everyone, towards that net zero target, which kind of requires a certain urgency around that. So I think you will see much more voting on this, particularly on remuneration.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Nicholas, maybe just building on that a bit, and I want to also just get a sense about how do we ensure that the board is equipped to provide oversight and to ensure that management has the necessary strategies, goals, skills, capabilities to address all the issues that Natasha and others have spoken about. Do you have any counsel for us?
You take us very quickly into that perennial debate, which is, do you need specialists on your board in particular areas in order to have that oversight? I'm probably in the camp where I put a lot more emphasis on directors being curious enough and spending enough time and intellectual enough to learn themselves, because I think that a board where you just try and address particular expertise and by having one or two board members focus on that and the others don't do it isn't the model to go forward. So I'm a big believer in approaching it both ways. So absolutely, you have to recruit people who are knowledgeable and sympathetic to the debate we're having, but also you have to have board directors who themselves educate themselves and become over time much more expert on these issues. So that's my approach to that question. And you know, empowering management in their recruiting policies and the way they look at how they bring people into their culture to make sure that you embed some of these key principles there. And I think if you put all that together, then you're back in my virtuous circle, and you're going to get some strategies that come out that we would like.
Very good. And those strategies will be more organic as opposed to forced or contrived. And it's key part of how business is done.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel that you know, that it is difficult in practice to have a carbon neutral pathway that you know isn't challenged by residual carbon emissions and how you're going to address things over time. I think it's difficult to have it in plain sight on day one, and so part of the challenge is how you break it down. And because a lot of the STIs that we're talking about are going to be 1 year or 2 year, and therefore the challenge is in the granularity and the measurability of it. And I think that's something we're all grappling with, and it varies industry by industry.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Natasha, if I could come back to you, stewardship is a key word and very dear to what you do. And stewardship, sort of in the classic definition of preserving and enhancing value over the long term. But question, how important are human capital levers as you think about the stewardship ethos? How important are human capital levers in driving climate change?
Well, I think I would start by saying people are everything, right? Well, until AI obviously takes over, but people are everything. You know, it's not faceless companies that are making decisions. It's the people running those businesses who are making decisions. And hence, I think stewardship does start with understanding those responsibilities and understanding the role of investors also in this context for holding directors to account for fulfilling those responsibilities. And that's a really important role in the market. But it's not just and we've been talking a lot about remuneration here and in incentives. And I think I started out by saying that it's really, you want the incentives to be aligned with the goals so that they're not running contrary to. It won't be incentives, in other words, it won't be, remuneration alone that will drive the alignment of the human capital. I mean, everyone in that business, I think, needs to understand the importance of this issue. I think that's about education. I think it's about leadership, and I think it's about culture that needs to permeate down. We heard actually Angeles again used a very good term which you picked up, which was this cascading down. And so for us certainly, and I think for many investors, the incentive framework needs to be supportive of that, but that alone won't be enough. We do need the tone from the top to be set in the right way. We need hearts and minds. I mean, if I often think about, I mean, Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, has a way with words, and I think we've all heard his incredibly strong and powerful statements about the need to act. And with the latest IPCC report, he talks about the need for everything, everywhere, all at once. And I think that's what we're dealing with here. And so it certainly can't just be REM.
Well said. Well said. Thank you. I'm going to note that down. It certainly can't just be REM. It may do a disservice to my profession, but I think it's the right thing for companies to do. Nick, coming back to you, you spoke about sort of the challenges with the short-term incentive and target setting. I often get asked the question, should we incorporate climate measures in the short-term incentive plan or the long-term incentive plan? And my answer is yes. In that it has to be both. There are activities and efforts that you reward through the short-term incentive, and the outcomes and big, hairy, audacious goals that you reward through the long-term incentive. But question to you, how do you deal with the challenge of target setting and also deal with sort of getting the management team aligned with some of these fairly stretched goals?
Yeah, I think that, again, it comes back very much around industry. So one industry I'm in is in an electricity utility, and that is very much at one end of a spectrum where in the Hong Kong context, we provide 80% of Hong Kong's electricity from various sources, and therefore if Hong Kong is going to decarbonize, we have to do it first. And so you have that alignment with what government wants to do, and everything kind of works in that direction. You have some heavily scrutinized science-based targets that enable you to populate a pathway, and therefore that naturally lends itself into the ability to reward people or not reward them according to that pathway. If I take another example, in the company I chair, which is a property business, we have much less of a government oversight as to what we're doing in our properties, and so it is left to us to deal with what we want to do around green leases, what we want to do about electricity usage, what we want to do around water. In our business, a lot of food waste, and so those are all kind of left to us to do. I think the challenge, and it was something I made a note to ask WTW in my neck of the woods, is really kind of the LTI piece, because the major REMCO I sit on has an LTI that has various targets that have to in turn be met in order to performance-based targets, and those tend to be financial. And so when you look at the remuneration of the executive in the round and you take it in total, even having something in STI in relation to ESG is not big in the round. And until you do crack the LTI piece, you're not going to be giving a heavy enough incentive. And I'm a big believer in that people will work towards as they are incentivized.
What gets rewarded gets done, indeed. And actually, we spoke about innovation earlier on, taking advantage of the ownership structures that we have. In this part of the world, there are few companies who actually have put up a separate incentive plan on top of the conventional performance share plan, which is linked purely to decarbonization goals, or in some cases, ESG goals, including percentage of women in leadership, and because these goals are not annual, they're not easy to achieve. And in some of these cases, it's actually a 5-year or 7-year long-term incentive plan, not the conventional 3-year incentive plan, because of recognition that these are difficult to achieve. So thank you. We'll sort of pick that up later as well. But conscious of time, Eliane, maybe one last question and we'll start wrapping up. So we've had a robust discussion and a lot of wonderful perspectives. What would you say, how should we ensure alignment to executive pay to help accelerate all that needs to happen? And how do we encourage all employees, the entire organization? Cascading is one thing, but are there elements beyond remuneration?
As it has been said by many of us, it's not only a question of KPIs, but I mean, the quality of managers we are looking for is also important as regard to their way to be able to embed the whole organization, mobilize efforts, stimulate innovation, and be also able to manage social issues which may come into contradiction to the short-term as a short-term goal, to more long-term goals, and that is becoming more and more difficult. Involvement of top executive is not enough. This has also to be challenged. having more and more trained members, being able to deep dive into more and more complex issues with a high level of technicity, cross experience between the audit committee members, the strategic and ESG committee, and also the compensation committee. And also, how can we try to encourage employees? It's important to set up priorities, the right pace at which it has to be put in place. Be sure that everybody in the organization understood what are the goals at the end of the day. The storytelling and the internal communication is absolutely key. Be sure that everybody is well informed, and the everyday decision is consistent, and consistency, coherence is very important between the intents and what is the day-to-day decision of the company. It's also a question of profile of a manager, as you have understood, convince people, brave, and also with high level of human consciousness.
Fantastic. Thank you. What a wonderful way to and call to action to bring this panel to close. So please, everybody join me in thanking the panel for their wonderful insights. We have a couple of minutes, and I did want to open sort of a minute for Angeles. Any final thoughts, Angeles? Any of the reflections that you wanted to share?
A lot has been said, and thank you very much to all the panelists for these wonderful perspectives. I've learned a great deal, and it got me thinking. I've got like 10 post-its around me of things that I should do after this. I think the words alignment, consistency, cascading, bold, time horizons, quantitative, material, and it's all about people.
Brilliant.
Which summarize what I heard this morning. So thank you, all of you, for that.
And thank you, Angeles. I know we're close to time, so please allow me to wrap up. So first of all, thank you, Angeles, Nick, Natasha, Aliane. Wonderful insights, and this is being recorded, so we have some of these for posterity. If I may just sort of end with three thoughts. Number one, there's this great line from The Godfather, which is one of my favorite movies. It's not personal, it's strictly business. And that very much applies to what we're talking about today. And we've done a lot of research on this topic, different archetypes of leaders. There are leaders who approach this topic from a moral imperative. I have 2 daughters and I want them to earn sort of $1 to a man's dollar, or I want to leave the world a better place for future generations. The moral imperative is admirable. Moral imperatives do not make long-lasting change. Long-lasting change only happens if companies realize the tangible financial and non-financial benefits that come from a good sustainability strategy. So that's number one. Number two, this saying, let perfection not be the enemy of the good. And that's very relevant to what we're talking about, particularly on remuneration. For most compensation issues, there is a playbook. How do we treat foreign exchange issues in TSR calculations? There is a playbook. But some of what we're talking about today, scope 3 emissions, target setting, the playbook is evolving. We're learning. But just because we don't have all the answers doesn't mean as directors we should not be asking the questions. So please don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. And the third thing is one of my favorite sayings. The good thing about incentives is that they drive behavior. The bad thing about incentives is that they drive behavior. It is our role as compensation committee members and chairs to encourage the right behaviors and discourage the wrong ones. And on that note, thank you all for joining us today. In terms of sort of housekeeping and closing remarks, just a quick plug for CGI. A reminder that we have more than 55 countries who are currently represented by the Climate Governance Initiative's network of chapters. And joining a chapter is the best way to continue this conversation on how do we drive climate action from the board level. Remember, this is a by directors for directors forum. Thank you all. Wonderful conversation. I wish you good health.